Content area literacy and disciplinary literacy. What's the difference and which one should I teach? Both content area literacy and disciplinary literacy are approaches to teaching secondary literacy in secondary settings. And so while there is some overlap between them, they are definitely not the same. And so this presentation hopes to at least spell out and explain a little bit how they differ. So some of the key concepts that we'll be addressing are content area literacy, often abbreviated as CAL, disciplinary literacy, DL, and then general comprehension thinking processes, and discipline-specific literacy practices. And a lot of these concepts are also explored in your readings for this week. Coming straight out of one of our readings this week is this quote here from Heather Latimer. We are no longer teaching students the core ideas of our discipline. Instead, we are inviting students to engage in the processes and practices of disciplines, allowing them to see behind the curtain and to participate in the fascinating challenge and often messy process by which experts continue to generate knowledge in their fields. So I highlight these areas, the core ideas from our discipline and the core processes and practices. So disciplinary literacy is really looking at how within a discipline, there are different mindsets, and those different mindsets have different processes and practices for making meaning. And so disciplinary literacy is not just about how you read differently in secondary years, but also how you read and make meaning in one discipline, such as math, is very different than how you read and make meaning in another discipline, such as social studies, history, or art. So the processes and ways of making meaning very much impact the literacy of that discipline. So you can't just teach one way to read. Reading varies quite a bit depending on the discipline. So let's try this out a bit. So using the mindset of your discipline, what are some of the first questions that come to your mind when you look at this image? Now, of course, you don't have to say these out loud, but just think, what are some of the questions that you have? Now, if you are an art education student or a student coming from an art background, some of your questions might be, what are they made of? It looks like a type of ceramic. Right away, you might be interested in the materials that it's made of, the medium. You might be interested right away, too, in, was this a community project of some sort, some type of community art? As where if you were a historian coming from a history mindset, some of your questions might be, when was this built? For what occasion? Is this a type of monument? What is the social context surrounding this wall? Do each of these represent different actors or players in an event? So all of these questions are very much coming out of a specific mindset of a discipline. So although we can have a singular text, different disciplines will come at that text and read it and interpret it very differently because they have different prior knowledge and ways of thinking and mindsets from that discipline. So thinking about literacy, specifically disciplinary literacy as a set of processes and mindsets, it helps us one way to help us think about that is to look at literacy as occurring in various levels. So here, basic literacy, this would be the literacy that you learn in your primary years of school. It has to do oftentimes with decoding, phonics, sentence fluency, what you're often learning in your first grades in primary school, first, second, third grade. Then you get into intermediate literacy. This is the literacy often that's referred to as content area literacy, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then you have what's considered this advanced literacy, the disciplinary literacy. So as I said, this intermediate literacy is often referred to as content area literacy. So as you can see by this diagram, the two are not the same. While there's definitely going to be some overlap between them, they are not the same. So we shouldn't use the terms interchangeably. So how are they different then? Here are a couple just brief definitions that are explaining how they are different. So first of all, content area literacy is the ability to use reading and writing for the acquisition of new content in a given discipline. And so this tends to focus on general strategies, as where disciplinary literacy is focusing on the mindsets and processes of making meaning and interpreting and producing text within a certain discipline. So it emphasizes more a unique, specific set of practices that only are used within a certain discipline. How how a math major looks at this image would be very different than, again, how a art major might look at this, or someone coming from engineering. So these are different, these have different literacy practices associated with them, but they can very much inform each other. Now, when thinking about content area literacy, oftentimes it talked about general comprehension strategies. These are some of the general comprehension strategies that are often associated with content area literacy. And many of these may look familiar. In fact, one of our readings for this week, the Buell reading, actually talks about each of these general comprehension strategies. So these would be very associated with, very much associated with content area reading. However, they can also be used as stepping stones for more discipline-specific ways of thinking. Now, when talking about disciplinary literacies, or the discipline-specific practices of making meaning, it's not so easy to just list them out, and because they differ depending on the discipline, and within the discipline what your specialty might be. So one of the ways to start to uncover what the disciplinary specific literacy practices of your field, of your practice might be, is to ask yourself some of these questions. What type of texts do you read and create in your discipline? Scientists might say that, oh, it's very common that we create scientific reports that follow the scientific method, and they have very specific genres and types of ways in which they are produced. Where someone from the arts might say, oh, we create texts that are like this. They're visual texts, or they're sculpture texts. Musicians create other types of text. So the type of text you create really inform the specific ways of thinking. What do you pay attention to when you read texts? What you pay attention to as a historian when reading a novel is very different than what a English major or literary analyst pays attention to. What types of questions do you ask yourself when reading an insider text, a text that's inside your discipline? How are the texts organized in your discipline? How are sentences constructed? What counts as evidence for an argument? What is evidence in one discipline, for example, science, is not necessarily the same evidence that would count in English, for example. What levels of confidence do you place in the knowledge that is produced within your field? Within history, each text can be given different levels of confidence, but yet all are seen as valuable in presenting a context and a social perspective of that situation. So all of these questions will have different answers depending on the discipline, and all of these questions and answers then make up the mindset of that discipline. When thinking about all of these very unique and specific ways of making meaning, or disciplinary literacies, some may think, wait a minute, that's a very advanced form of literacy. Why should I bother even teaching that literacy if I don't have students that can even read at this literacy level? And that is one way to look at the situation. And many people argue that we shouldn't be thinking about disciplinary literacy so much because we need to just focus on intermediate literacy. However, the two work very much together. And not only do they work together, but there are many arguments that talk about how disciplinary literacy, being able to learn the discipline-specific aspects of literacy, is actually a social justice issue, and that it's necessary for providing equitable education, that we can't just teach some students some types of literacy while other students are getting taught more advanced types of literacy. So this can be very much a critical issue to explore, and an equity issue. So we can't just easily say, don't teach one because some don't know this, but really it's about thinking about how do the two inform each other. So when thinking about content area literacy and disciplinary literacy and which to teach as a teacher, the answer is to use both, to teach both. So that doesn't mean that your students have to be an expert at both, but consider how using the general comprehension strategies of content area literacy, how can those be used as touch points and stepping stones to supporting discipline-specific literacies. Now, your goal may not be to produce an engineer leaving your 9th grade science classroom. However, that student can hopefully leave your classroom having some of the mindsets of a scientific thinker. And using some of these general comprehension strategies of content area reading, content area literacy, can definitely help your students get to that point. So when choosing these general comprehension strategies, and you'll be reading about those this week, Some of the questions to ask yourself are, does this strategy help my students understand the subject matter discussed in the text? Does this strategy perhaps inform specifically some of the ways of thinking in your discipline? Is this strategy one that a disciplinary expert would find reasonable? Is this strategy something that a historian would actually use? Is it similar to some of their mindsets? And third, how does this strategy help students meet the aims of a particular discipline? So once you get to know the strategies, start thinking about which are more relevant to your discipline. And if we had some historians here, they might talk about inferring and determining importance as being key parts of the way that historians think, as where those from the creative arts might discuss creating visualizations as a key part of making meaning in their discipline. All disciplines might argue that activating prior knowledge and making connections across texts is a practice that they make in their disciplines, but some perhaps more than others. So as you go forward, it's not necessarily about which one should I do, but really how can you do both? How can you use the two to inform each other? Hopefully the readings for this week and this mini lecture help to give you just a beginning look into how the two are different and how you might approach them differently going forward in your own teaching.